Imagine standing at the edge of the world, not metaphorically. Literally, the ice stretches out before you in every direction, an infinite white nothing that swallows sound and light and hope with equal indifference. The temperature has dropped so far below zero that the numbers no longer feel real. Your fingers stopped hurting days ago, which should comfort you, but it doesn't because you know what that means. The ship that brought you here is gone, crushed. Buried beneath a frozen sea that closed around it like a fist, and the men you are responsible for are looking at you with eyes that ask a question you don't know how to answer. What do we do now? This is not myth. This is not legend. This happened to real men with real names and real families waiting for them back home. Men who kissed their wives goodbye and told their children they would return with stories worth telling. Men who had no idea that the story they were about to live would become one of the most harrowing survival tales in the entire history of human exploration. This is the story of the Arctic expeditions that turned into human nightmares. And before we are finished, you are going to understand something profound about what human beings are capable of when everything is stripped away. When there is no rescue coming. When there is no warmth, no food, no shelter, and no reason left to believe that tomorrow will be anything other than colder and darker and more cruel. Let us begin where all Arctic nightmares begin. With ambition. With the burning, almost religious desire to go where no one has gone before. To solve the great geographical puzzle that obsessed European explorers for centuries, the Northwest Passage. The fabled sea route through the Arctic, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific, threading through the frozen labyrinth of islands above North America. Find it and your nation would grow rich. Find it and your name would be spoken alongside Columbus and Magellan. The British were particularly obsessed. The Royal Navy, flush with confidence after defeating Napoleon at Waterloo, turned its attention north. Ship after ship sailed into the ice and returned with tales of hardship that somehow only sharpened the hunger for more. Because they kept coming back. They kept surviving. The Arctic had not yet shown what it was truly capable of. That revelation was reserved for one expedition above all others, the one that would become synonymous with catastrophe. The Franklin Expedition of 1845. Sir John Franklin was 60 years old when he sailed from England in May of that year, commanding two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. These were among the most advanced ships of their era, reinforced for Arctic conditions, fitted with steam engines, stocked with enough provisions to last 3 years. Franklin himself was a celebrated veteran. He had survived a previous Arctic expedition so brutal his party ate their own leather boots to stay alive, earning him the nickname the man who ate his shoes. He had survived that, surely he would conquer this. The ships carried 129 men, officers, sailors, surgeons, marines. They carried books and telescopes and musical instruments. They carried the quiet, absolute certainty that they were going to succeed. They waved goodbye to the watching crowds and sailed north. And were never seen again, not a single one. Gone. All 129 of them swallowed by the Arctic without a trace, leaving behind only silence and the slowly dawning horror that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The first real clue came 11 years later in 1857, when an expedition funded by Franklin's widow Lady Jane Franklin found something on King William Island. A cairn, a stone pile. Inside it, a single sheet of paper bearing 2 messages written at different times. The first, from April 1847, was reassuring, all well, the expedition proceeding as planned. The second, scrawled around the margins 1 year later, was anything but. Franklin was dead. 24 officers and men were dead. The ships had been trapped in ice for 18 months. The remaining 105 survivors were setting out on foot toward the back river, hundreds of miles to the south, attempting to walk to safety. They were never heard from again. But the paper told only bare facts. The real story was written not in ink but in bones. Over the decades that followed, searchers and scientists painstakingly pieced together what had happened in those final months. The men had suffered from lead poisoning, almost certainly from badly soldered food tins, slowly destroying their nervous systems, impairing their judgment, making them weak and confused at precisely the moment they needed to be clear-headed. They had scurvy. They had tuberculosis. They walked south across the ice, dragging impossibly heavy sledges loaded with absurd and useless things. A writing desk, a lightning rod, silverware, button polish, things that made no sense for men trying to survive. Things that suggested minds no longer capable of rational thought. And then there are the bones, found at various sites on King William Island, bearing cut marks, deliberate, unmistakable marks made by metal tools consistent with defleshing, with the removal of meat from bone. The Franklin survivors in their final extremity had eaten the dead. Perhaps they had killed the living. The nightmare that began with the finest ships and the highest confidence the British Empire could produce ended here, in the ice, with men consuming each other in a futile attempt to survive one more day. None of them made it, not one. The Franklin expedition is the most famous Arctic disaster in history, but it is far from the only one. Consider the USS Jeannette. It is 1879. The American Arctic expedition led by Lieutenant Commander George Washington DeLong departs San Francisco with 33 men, heading north through the Bering Strait. The theory driving the expedition, widely accepted at the time, is that the Arctic Ocean near the pole is an open, navigable sea kept warm by the Gulf Stream. Get past the belt of ice around it and you would sail in open water all the way to the North Pole. It is a beautiful theory, it is completely wrong. The Jeannette entered the Arctic ice and was immediately trapped. Not for weeks, not for months, for almost 2 years, frozen solid into the pack ice, drifting helplessly wherever the ice decided to take her, unable to do anything at all except wait and endure and try not to go mad. DeLong and his men watched the sun disappear for months at a time, leaving them in a darkness so absolute it felt like burial. They watched the ice shift and press against the ship's hull with unimaginable force, the timbers groaning under the pressure, every man lying awake wondering if tonight would be the night the ship finally gave way. They celebrated Christmases in the ice. They held scientific readings and amateur theatricals and tried in every way they knew to maintain some semblance of civilization in a situation that was neither normal nor civilized. In June of 1881, the ice made its decision. The pressure became too great. The Jeannette's hull began to fail, water flooding in faster than the pumps could handle, and DeLong gave the order to abandon ship. The men had 12 minutes to grab what they could before she sank. They managed to save 3 small boats and enough provisions for a desperate march south across the ice toward the Siberian coast, hundreds of miles away. They dragged those boats across the ice for weeks, hauling them over pressure ridges and across freezing open water, making perhaps a mile or two of southward progress on a good day, losing ground overnight when the ice drifted north. Men's feet froze and turned black. Their dogs died one by one, their food ran out, and still they pulled, because stop was to die. They finally reached open water in September of 1881 and launched into the Siberian Sea during a storm. The 3 boats were separated in the darkness and the waves. 2 of them eventually found the Siberian coast. The third, commanded by DeLong himself, also reached land, but not in time. When rescue finally came months later, DeLong and most of his men were dead, their frozen bodies arranged around a final campfire. His journal recorded the last days with heartbreaking composure. October 30, Boyd and Gortz died during the night. October 31, Dressler died during the night. November 1, oh God, and then nothing. The journal ends there in the Siberian wilderness, thousands of miles from home. And then there is the story that most people have never heard, the one that, in certain ways, surpasses even Franklin for sheer accumulated horror: the Greely expedition. Lieutenant Adolphus Greely was an Army officer when he led the Lady Franklin Bay expedition to Ellesmere Island in 1881. His mission was scientific: establish a station at the most northerly point in North America, gather data for the first international polar year, and if possible set a new farthest north record. He accomplished all of this. One of his men, Sergeant James Lockwood, did reach a new farthest north in the spring of 1882. The science was thorough and impressive, and then everything went wrong. The plan called for a relief ship every summer. The ship in 1882 could not get through the ice. The ship in 1883 also failed. With no relief coming and provisions dangerously low, Greely made the only decision available: retreat south in small boats toward the supply depot at Cape Sabine on the far side of Baffin Bay. They set out in August of 1883. By September they were trapped by ice and forced to winter at Cape Sabine, and there the nightmare began in earnest. The supply depot they had counted on was devastated. There were not enough rations to sustain 25 men through an Arctic winter, not even close. Greely organized rationing with military precision, calculating and recalculating how long the impossible could be stretched. The men built a hut of stones and earth. They lived in it through the winter, growing weaker every day, their bodies consuming themselves for fuel. By the time spring arrived, men were dying regularly, quietly, sometimes in the night so that their comrades woke to find another body in the frozen dark. One man was shot by Greely's order for repeatedly stealing from the communal food supply, the ultimate crime in a community where every mouthful was the difference between life and death. His name was Private Charles Henry, and the decision has been debated ever since. Not because anyone seriously argues Greely was wrong, but because of what it reveals about the moral territory these men had entered. A territory where ordinary rules no longer applied and harder, darker rules had taken their place. And then there is the evidence that emerged afterward. The evidence that several of the men who died at Cape Sabine had been eaten. not as a frantic final resort but as a sustained practice over weeks and months. The bodies were found with flesh removed. Greeley refused to discuss it. Some survivors denied it. Others said nothing at all. The evidence was real and it was quietly buried, covered up by the army and the press in the interests of the survivors' reputations and the nation's dignity. But it happened. In that stone hut in the Arctic winter of 1883 to 1884, men had eaten men because the Arctic had stripped them of every other option. When the relief ship finally arrived in June of 1884, they found 7 men alive out of 25. 6 could not walk. Greeley himself was barely conscious, surrounded by the frozen bodies of his dead. The rescue party had to drag the survivors into the light. What the Arctic does to the human mind is as devastating as what it does to the body. The darkness of the polar winter, months of absolute unbroken darkness, destroys the sense of time, of rhythm, of the organizing principle of consciousness itself. Combined with cold and hunger and isolation and the constant stress of survival, it produces a madness that has been documented in expedition after expedition. Men hear voices, men see things that are not there, they weep without cause. They laugh at nothing. They hide their rations from their friends, clutching food they cannot bring themselves to eat, afraid someone will steal it, willing to starve rather than share. The doctors who treated Arctic survivors had no adequate language for what they were seeing. They called it Arctic hysteria, polar madness. We understand it better now. We know that what prolonged darkness and isolation do to the human brain is profound and sometimes permanent. Some survivors never fully recovered. They came home and found they could not sleep without the light on, could not be in enclosed spaces, could not bear the sound of wind without their hands beginning to shake. And yet, here is the thing that all of these stories circle around, the thing at the dark heart of every one of them. These men were not forced to go, they chose to. Something in the human spirit demands to know what lies beyond the last map. They paid for that curiosity with everything they had. Some paid with their lives, some with their sanity, some with their dignity and the comfortable certainty that they knew who they were. The Arctic stripped all of that away with brutal efficiency, leaving only the raw, irreducible truth of what a human being is when there is nothing left. The Northwest Passage, that great object of so much ambition and so many deaths, was finally navigated for the first time in 1906 by Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen. It took him 3 years. The route he found was shallow, treacherous, ice-choked, and of essentially no commercial value whatsoever. The dream that consumed so many lives led nowhere useful. It made no one rich. The men who died for it suffered and died for a geographical fact of no particular practical importance. And that makes the whole thing even more extraordinary, because it means what drove them was not greed. It was something purer and more dangerous than greed. It was curiosity, the need to know, the deep, irrational, irresistible hunger to go to the hardest places in the world and find out what was there. What was there, as it turned out, was death, and madness, and terrible choices made under impossible pressure, and extraordinary acts of courage and loyalty that still take your breath away a century later. The Arctic is in the end the most honest place on Earth, because the comfortable world, the warm world, the world of enough food and adequate shelter, that world lets us maintain the comfortable illusion that we know ourselves, that we know who we are and what we would do. The Arctic removes that illusion. The Arctic says, "You do not know yourself, not yet. Come north and I will show you." They went north, and the Arctic showed them everything. The heroism and the savagery and the tenderness and the cruelty, all tangled together, inseparable, true. And we who sit here warm and safe and fed, reading their stories across a century of distance, should not be too quick to judge, should not be too quick to say what we would have done differently, how we would have been braver or wiser or more humane. The ice has a way of making such certainties feel very fragile. Because the question the Arctic has always asked has not changed, not since the first ship pushed north into the white unknown, not since the first man looked out at the endless frozen horizon and kept walking anyway. How much can you bear, and what will you do when you have borne all that you can? The answer, it turns out, is that human beings will bear almost anything, and they will do almost anything. Even knowing the darkest parts of these stories, the bones with cut marks, the frozen bodies, the men who went mad in the dark, there is something in the telling that is not entirely bleak, because they tried, every single one of them. With everything they had in conditions that beggar imagination, they tried to live. They tried to hold on to each other and to themselves and to the belief that somewhere at the end of the cold there was warmth, somewhere at the end of the ice there was a shore. Sometimes there was, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, there was not. But they kept going until they found out. That is what the Arctic reveals about us. That is what it has always revealed about the monster and the hero that live together in every human heart, waiting for the temperature to drop far enough, the darkness to grow deep enough for one of them to come forward. The ice knows which one it will be. It has always known. It waits, cold and vast and indifferent. It does not care. It simply exists, and we go into it of our own free will, carrying our ambitions and our maps that end in blank white space. And the blank white space turns out to be exactly what it always looked like. Nothing and everything, and the beginning of finding out who we really are. There is a particular kind of silence that survivors describe when they speak of the Arctic, and the ones who could speak of it at all were few enough. It is not the silence of peace, not the silence of a quiet evening or a still morning or a church before the congregation arrives. It is the silence of erasure, of a world so cold and so vast and so completely indifferent to your existence that the sound of your own heartbeat begins to feel like an intrusion. Men who came back from the ice described lying awake in that silence for hours at a time, listening to their own breathing, wondering how long it would continue. Not in a morbid way exactly, in a purely practical way. Each breath was a calculation. Each heartbeat was a small negotiation with a cold that wanted nothing except to be left alone to do its work. George Melville, the chief engineer of the Jeannette, survived the disaster and spent months searching the Siberian wilderness for his lost companions. He came home and spent years writing and lecturing, trying to process what he had experienced. He described being in the Arctic winter as like being buried alive, the darkness pressing in, the cold like a physical weight on the chest, the sense that the world outside had ended and you were among the last people in it. He was a practical man, a machinist and engineer by training, not given to poetry, and yet the Arctic put something in him that would not come out through ordinary language. He wrote about the cold the way poets write about grief, with a kind of helpless precision, numbing the exact quality of a thing that resists numbing. Because the cold is not just cold. Anyone who has stood in a proper Arctic winter will tell you that it changes categories entirely somewhere around -40. It stops being a sensation and becomes a presence, something with weight and intention, pressing against your clothing, finding every gap, every imperfection, every place where the seal is not quite complete. The explorers of the 19th century faced that cold in wool and leather and animal skins. No synthetic materials. No modern insulation. No understanding of the physiology of hypothermia, of why the body shuts down in the order it does, of why the last thing a freezing person often feels is warmth, a deadly warmth, a lying warmth, a warmth that is the body surrendering and the brain misreading the signal. Men took off their clothes in the final stages of freezing to death. They were found that way, undressed in the ice. The doctors called it paradoxical undressing. The men who found the bodies called it something else. They called it heartbreaking, and they were right.